In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural raw beef steak material. Now, I just recently posted another tutorial showing you how to make a cooked beef steak material, so if you want to check out that video, I'll have a link in the description, but in this video, we'll be creating a raw beef steak. And after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join it together into this custom node group with customizable values. So we have the scale value to change the size of the material, then we also have the large fat scale, and then also the small fat scale. Then we have the meat color, so this is kind of that red color, so you can change the meat color here. And then we also have the fat color, which is kind of that whitish pinkish color. Then we have the fat distortion, so you can make it less distorted or more distorted, but I have it here at 0.5. Then we also have this fat detail, so you can actually turn this down if you want to make some sort of like stylized steak material. So maybe if you're making kind of like a low poly kitchen scene or something, or a stylized low poly scene, you can kind of turn that down. And then you can also turn down the bump strength. And now you can see by turning down the bump strength and the fat detail, we kind of have this cool stylized raw steak material. So that's just something you can do with this material if you want to do that. And then we also have the fat detail 2, and then of course the fat detail 1. But the fat detail 2 is going to add even more detail. Then we also have the subsurface scattering, and so this is going to allow light to go through the material, and it's going to make it look more fleshy and more like food. Then we have the roughness of the material to make it more rough or shiny. Then we also have the bump strength. And then finally, we have the displacement strength to pop out the mesh. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all of my materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you'll also get future updates with more materials, so every time I create 10 more procedural materials, I update the procedural material pack with the 10 new materials. And if you're interested in just purchasing some procedural food, then I have some procedural food packs, so you can check those out with the links in the description. And you can purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create more materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And then real quick before we start the tutorial, I wanted to let you know that Blender Market is currently having their 2024 summer sale. And during the sale, all of my products on the Blender Market are 25% off. So if you've been wanting to purchase my Ultimate Material Pack or my Procedural Material Packs, or maybe some of my tutorial courses like my Sci-Fi Construction Robot tutorial series, or maybe some of my Geometry Node modifier setups, then now's a great time to purchase because you can get 25% off during Blender Market's summer sale. And the sale is going on from August 20th through August 25th of 2024. So real quick, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I did. So I went to the add menu and I just added a cube. I went to edit mode and I kind of scaled the cube down, scaled it in like this. Also, if I go to the face select, I selected this face and kind of scaled it in, maybe scaled the whole thing down a little bit more. And then I also selected everything and I scaled it down by 0.2, and then just make sure you press Ctrl A and apply the scale, so that's the default size of the object. Then I pressed Ctrl 4. Ctrl 4 is going to add a subdivision surface with 4 levels. And I went back into edit mode and I pressed Ctrl R to add some loop cuts. And I just scrolled out my mouse wheel, added a loop cut there, added a few loop cuts there, and just made the very basic shape of the beef steak. Then over here on the side panel, if you go to the modifiers, I clicked on the drop down and I applied the modifiers. So now you can see that's actual geometry. So then what I did is I went into sculpt mode, and if I press the T key to open up the side panel, I'll just go to the clay strips brush, and I just went along here and I just started to kind of sculpt the object. And I just made a very basic beef steak object, kind of a beef steak shape. So I'm kind of just going along here and adding little bumps and stuff here and there just to make it look kind of random. And then you can also hold down the shift key as you're sculpting to smooth it out. You can also go to the grab brush. You can use the grab brush to kind of pull around the mesh and kind of shape it. Then you can also go to the crease brush by clicking right here, and I'll make my brush a little bit smaller, and then you can hold down the control key and you can click and drag, and that is going to pull out the mesh and kind of crease it. Instead of creasing it back in, it's going to crease it out and kind of pinch it. So I just creased along here and kind of creased the edge of that beef steak. And then I also need to hold down the shift key and kind of smooth some of this out and just kind of crease the whole steak object. So once I was done sculpting, I pressed the R key to use the remesh feature, and you can move your mouse in and out to change the size or the detail of the remesh. And after you've gotten it to a size that you like, I think maybe That is pretty good. Then you can press Control R, and Control R is going to remesh it. So now if I go to edit mode, you can see it's remeshed it. So the detail is pretty even. And I do want lots of geometry so that the displacements can actually use the detail of the mesh to pop out the mesh. So I'll go back to object mode. And then in object mode, I'm just going to shade this object smooth. And so this is the final object that I'm going to be using in the tutorial. Then I also added this camera here, and I just pointed the camera at the object. And if you click on the camera and then go to the object data properties, I turn the focal length up to 90 just to kind of zoom the camera in a bit. And then I'll go into the rendered viewport mode and I'll show you the lighting. So for the lighting, I kind of wanted to add like a bit of a rim light on the back. So I added this area light and I turned the power up to about 47. And then also I went here to the world properties and I added in this Machine Shop 02 HDRI. This is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com and I'll have the link in the description. And I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version from Polyhaven. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on this yellow dot here next to color and you can choose environment texture and then just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And then just a few more settings that I'll go over. If you go here to the render properties, I'm going to be using the Cycles rendering engine because I'm going for realism, but you could also use Eevee if you want to. And then also if you open up the film tab right here, I checkmarked the transparent button just because I like that better so the background isn't quite as distracting, but it's still going to light the 3D scene. And then also if you open up the color management here, I'm going to be using the View Transform of Filmic, and I'll set the look to very high contrast. So I'm going to click over here to go to the shading workspace. So I'm in the camera view right here in the 3D viewport, and I'll go into the rendered viewport mode. So then over here I have the shader editor. So I'll select the object and I will click on new to add a new material. And I'll just call this raw beef steak. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on in the video. So if you don't have that enabled, you can click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and then over here on the add-ons tab, if you go to the search, you can search for Node Wrangler and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So we're first going to start off by creating the texture group, which is going to be those large bits of fat. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's drop this here. And with the noise texture selected, I'll press Control T. And that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler add-on. And I want to use the object coordinates because the object coordinates are going to place the noise texture on the object more evenly. So I'll put the object into the vector. And then this material will get a little bit complex. So to keep my nodes nicely organized, I'm going to be adding frames. So I'm first going to click and drag over the texture coordinate and mapping to select both of them. And I'll press Control J to join them together into a frame. So you can select the frame and move it around. And I'm going to click on the frame and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this mapping. So let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it, and I want to change a few of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 8, and I want to turn the detail up to 15 so it is pretty detailed, and then here on the roughness I will turn this up to like 8.6. Now I want to distort this noise texture with another texture because fat on beefsteak looks kind of random and it's kind of twisted and it looks a bit distorted. So I'm going to duplicate this noise texture and I'm going to put it here before the first one. And then I want to change a few of this noise settings. So for this one, I'm going to turn the scale to a 2.2, and then the detail, I'll leave that at 15, and the roughness I'll turn to a 0.5. Now it's distorting it too much and I want this noise texture to have less of an effect over this noise texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the mix color and we'll put it in between both of the noise textures. So now what I want to do is I want to take the noise texture factor and I'm going to put that into color B. So that's going to be the distorted one. Then this mapping here, this isn't distorted at all, and so that's going to be going into color A. So now the factor is going to blend between more distorted and less distorted. And let's click on the mix type here, and we're going to change it to linear light instead. And this way, when I drag the factor, it's going to distort the texture, but it's not going to move it around quite so much. Now I'm going to leave the factor at a 0.5 because I like how much distortion that is. However, I do want to add a color ramp to make it more contrasty because everything is really gray right now. So to make it more contrasted, I'll go to the add menu and we'll search for a color ramp and we'll put it here after the noise texture. Now if I drag both of these tabs together, you can see it's going to be very contrasty. So I'll put this white tab kind of about here and then I'll put the black tab right about there. So that's going to be it for the large fat texture. So I'll click and drag to box select these nodes. I'll press Control J to join them together into a frame just to keep the nodes nicely organized. And I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'll call this large fat texture. So I now want to create another texture, which is going to be some very small bits of fat in the meat. So I'll click and drag to box select all of these nodes, and I'll press Control-Shift-D. So Control-Shift-D is going to duplicate the nodes, but it's going to keep the wires plugged up. So the mapping is plugged up to the textures. Let's Control-Shift and select this color ramp to preview it, and I can change a few of the settings. So on this noise texture here, the second noise texture, I'm going to change the scale to a 43, and then I'll leave the other settings how they are. And then this noise texture right over here, I'm also going to leave these settings how they are. So now for this color ramp, we can change the contrast. So I want to make it less visible. So I'm going to drag the white tab kind of over here and the black tab over here so it is less visible. So there's just a little bit of white spots here and there, and that's going to be the small bits of fat. Let's click on this frame right here, and I'll press F2 to change the label. And instead of large fat texture, I'm going to call it small fat texture. So we now have the large fat texture and the small fat texture, and I want to mix them both together. So if we select both of the color ramps at once, I can press Ctrl-0, and that is going to add this mix color here. You can open it up and bring it over here, and we're going to mix both of them together. Now I just want to add the light values, and when we're talking about the colors here, black equals 0 and white equals 1. So if we click on the mix type here, I can change it to the type add, so change it to add, and that way it's just going to add the light values. And I'll turn the factor all the way up to 1. So now you can see before it's just using the small one, but if I turn it up to 1, it's going to add all of the light values of the large fat texture. So now we have both of them mixed together. So now I want to create the base colors because I don't just want it to be white and black. I want to make it kind of a reddish color for the meat and also a white color. So I'll go to the add menu and we're going to search for another mix color, and we'll put this after the add. Now the result can go into the factor, and that way the white and black values are going to determine what parts are going to be color A and what parts are going to be color B. So for color A, I'm going to make this kind of like a darkish red color, something like that. And for color B, this is going to be kind of a pinky orangey light color. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, then you can use the same hex values. So here on color A, this is going to be a hex value of 731A0E, and for color B, this will be a hex value of BC7C75. So I can take the mix result and I can put that into the base color of the shader, and I can Control Shift and select the shader to preview it. And I'll just drag the shader up here. So then I can turn the roughness down to make it more shiny, to make it look like wet meat. So I'll turn the roughness to like a 0.3, and that makes it look a bit more like raw meat. And let's also open up the subsurface here. I want to give it some subsurface to allow light to go through the meat to make it look more like fleshy food. So on the weight here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.5 to add some subsurface. And also on the random walk here, I want to change it to random walk skin because that looks a bit better for the meat. So I now want to create a texture group, which is going to be the bump, because if you look closely at meat, it kind of has some like muscle fibers, and it kind of has an interesting texture of the muscle fibers of the meat. So we're going to be creating a texture and putting that into the normal. So I'll go to the add menu and we're going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop it here, and I'll Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. And here on the F1 type, I'm going to change it to distance to edge instead. And then let's change the scale. So I'm going to change the scale to 150. Let's turn the detail up a little bit to like a 0.8, so it has a bit of detail. And then also let's turn the roughness to a 0.63. So then on the Voronoi, I also want to use the object coordinates. So we'll take the mapping vector, we'll put that into the vector of the Voronoi. So now I want to distort the Voronoi with another texture. So we're going to kind of do the same setup with the noise and the linear light to distort it. So I'll go to the add menu and we'll search for a noise, and we'll put the noise between the mapping and the Voronoi, and we'll change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to a 3.55. I think that's a pretty good size. And I'll turn the detail to the max of 15, but then I'll leave the other settings how they are. Now that's way too distorted, so to make it less distorted, we'll go to the add menu and we'll search for a mix color. We'll put this between the noise and the Voronoi, and then on the mix type here, again, we're going to choose linear light. Now we want to take the noise texture color and we're going to put that into color B, and this is the one which will be distorted, but then the mapping here, this isn't distorted at all, so we're going to put that into color A. So now the factor can blend between distorting it a lot or not distorting it at all. And I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.132. I think a 0.132 is pretty good. So now you can see it is just distorted a little bit and it looks more noisy. Now I also want to stretch out the meat fibers so that they're going along the steak. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a mapping node, and we'll put this after the linear light but before the Voronoi. And I can now change the scale values to kind of stretch it. So on the X value, I'm going to turn it to a 1.6, and on the scale Y, I'm going to turn it to a negative 0.3, just a negative 0.3. So now you can see it's kind of stretched back and forth along the stake. And then finally, I want to make it more contrasted, so I'll go to the add menu, we'll search for a color ramp, and I'll put that after the Voronoi. And then I actually want to flip the two values, so I'll drag the white tab over here, and I'll drag the black tab to about there, so it just looks more contrasted, so something like that is pretty good. So I'll box select these nodes, and I will join them together into a frame, and I will add a label, and I'm going to call this meat bump texture. So I can now take the color ramp color and I can put that into this normal here. So this purple one that's called normal. Let's control shift and select the principled shader to preview it. But you can see there's some really weird shading issues. It looks really dark. That's because we need to convert the color data into normal data that the shader can use. So to do this, we're going to add a bump node, and we'll put the bump node between the color ramp and the normal. And we want to put the color into the height value. That's going to convert it to proper normal data. Now, I actually want to click on the invert buttons because I think inverting it looks a bit better. And then it's way too strong, so let's turn the strength value to a much smaller number of 0.15. So that's much better, but now you can see it looks like those muscle fibers in the meat. So now I want to add some displacement, so let's add a noise texture for that. So I'll go to the add menu, we're going to search for a noise texture, drop it down here, and we want to take the same vector of the mapping and put that into the vector of the noise. Let's control shift and select the noise to preview it, and I'll change some of the settings. So we're just making a texture which will be a little bit bumpy around for the meat, and that'll go into the displacement. So I'll turn the scale to 4, and I'll turn the detail up to 8, so it is a bit detailed but not super detailed. And then I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now what we can do is we can put the factor into the displacement of the material output, and let's control shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now you can see it is kind of working. It does look like it's bumping out the mesh, but it's not actually popping out the mesh, even though it looks like it has detail on the surface. So to fix this, we need to go to the side panel, and we need to go to the material settings and go to the settings and the surface. And on the displacement, we want to change it to displacement and bump, so it's using the displacements. So we can now close the side panel. So now you can see that the object is like jutting off to the side, and that is because just like we did for the bump here, we need a node to convert the black and white data of the noise into displacement data that the material output can use. So we'll go to the add menu, we're going to add the displacement node, we'll put this here in the wire between the noise and the displacement, and I'll drag it down here, and then we want the factor to be going into the height value to convert it to displacement data. Now it's way too strong, so if I just turn the scale way down, I'll turn it to a 0.02. Now you can see it is popping out of the mesh. If I just turn the scale up a little bit more, you can kind of see what it's doing. So it is now displacing the mesh, and that's looking great. Now if I zoom in here, I want these large bits of fat to also be popping out of the mesh more. So I'm going to mix in the texture of the large bits of fat into the displacement. So to do this, I'll go to the add menu, we'll search for a mix node. Actually, we want to add the mix color node. So drag the mix color node right here between the noise and the displacement. We'll just drop it there. And I just want to add the light values because the light values are going to be that fat there, the bigger parts of fat. So on the mix type here, I'm going to change this to add instead. Then we're going to take the noise texture factor and we're going to make sure that's going into color A. But then for color B, we're going to take the large fat texture, that is this one right here, and we're going to put the color into color B. And so this way it's just going to add the light values, which are the bits of fat. So if I control shift and select the principled shader, you can now see that where the fat is, that is popping out of the mesh. So now the factor is going to add more of it or less of it. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.2 just so it's pretty subtle. But now where the fat is, it's going to be popping out a little bit more. So we'll box select these nodes and we'll join them into a frame, and I'll add a label and I'll just call this displacement. So I'll now show you how to join it together into a custom node group. So we can box select all the nodes except the material output. Let's press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. And I can hit the tab key with the node group selected to go in and out of the node group. So I'll drag the node group over here. Let's drag it out to make it a little bit bigger so it looks better. Drag it there. And then I can click here on the name and I can copy the material name and I can paste it here into the node group. So I'll now hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. Let's just open up this side panel here. And if we go to the group tab, we can go to the group sockets, and I want to double click on the BSDF, and I'll rename that to shader because I like that better. So now over here, we have this group input, and we can plug values up to this group input to control them outside of the node group. So this mapping scale, or this mapping, is plugged up to all the textures, so we can use the scale value here to change the size of the entire material. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket, and if I click on the scale, I want to just be 1 value instead of 3. So I'll change the type here to float instead, and then I need to change the default value back to 1, and then I need to hit tab to go out of the node group, and I need to turn the scale back to 1. So we'll go back into the node group. Now I also want to control just the fat scale, so if I drag this up here, we have the large fat scale, and that's this here. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket, and I'll rename it to large fat scale. And then the same thing for the small fat scale. So this noise texture here, we'll put the scale into the extra socket, and this one I'm going to rename to small fat scale. Then I want to control the colors, so I'll drag the group input over here. Let's go over here to this mix, and here's the meat color, so I'll put that into the extra socket, and the fat color, put that into the extra socket. Double click on these to rename them, and I'll rename this to meat color. And then the other one, this is going to be called fat color. Then I want to control the distortion of the fat, so I'll drag the group input back here behind the small fat and the large fat, and we have these two factors here which are going to distort it more. So let's take the factor and put that into the extra socket there, and then this linear light factor, we're going to put this one into the same exact socket as the other one. This way, this factor is going to control both of the distortions for them at the same time. And then I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to fat distortion. So if I go outside of the node group, this fat distortion now is distorting both of them at once because we plugged them into the same socket. So we'll go back into the node group. Now I also want to control the detail of the fat, and all of these 4 noise textures, they all have a detail value of 15. So I'm going to take the detail value from all 4 of these, and I'm going to put them all into the same exact socket. So this one here, and then also this one here. And then I'll click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to fat detail 1. And then for the second layer of fat detail, I'm going to use these roughness. So I'll put this roughness into the extra socket, and then this one here, I'll put this one into the same exact socket. Let's rename this here, so instead of calling it roughness, I'll call it fat detail 2. Then I want to control the subsurface, so I'll drag the group input over here next to the shader. Let's take the subsurface weight, and I'll put that into the extra socket. And then I want to rename this, I'll just rename it subsurface, but you could call it subsurface scattering or whatever you want to call it. And then also we'll put the roughness into the extra socket there so we can control the roughness. Then I want to control the bump strength, so I'll drag this down here. We can take this bump strength and put that into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to bump strength. And then I finally want to control the displacements, so I'll drag this down here. Let's take the displacement scale, and I can put that into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to displacement strength. And then one more thing that I thought would be cool to add is this add right here. We have this factor, and the factor is going to make the fat pop out. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket here, and then this one I'm going to rename to fat displacement strength. Alright, so I'll hit the N key to close the side panel, and I'll click on the group input, and I'll drag it over here at the end, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside of the node group. And we can now review the finished procedural material. So we have the scale of the material, we also have the large fat scale, and we have the small fat scale. Then we have the meat colors, so we have the meat color and then also the fat color. Then we have the fat distortion, and then we have the fat detail 1. And again, if you want to make this look like kind of like a toon style or low poly kind of stylized raw meat, you could turn the fat detail way down to a very small number, maybe just change it down to maybe like a 1 or something like that, or maybe like a 2. And then you could also take the bump strength and you could turn that down to 0. And that way we have a really cool kind of stylized meat texture. So that's pretty cool. But I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that, or you can hover your mouse over the values and hit the backspace, and that is going to reset it to the default value that we set it as. And then we have the fat detail 2. Then we have the subsurface. We also have the roughness to make it more shiny. We also have the bump strength. Then we have the displacement strength to pop out the mesh, and then we have the fat displacement strength. So that's going to be it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, you can purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store in my Patreon page. The links are in the description. You can also check out my other steak tutorial. So I recently posted a cooked beef steak tutorial, so if you'd like to check out that video, I will have the link in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, you can check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, definitely check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.